The human arrived on Exchange Station Pelinar on the third day of the vernal rotation, carrying one bag and smiling at everyone who looked at her. Dr. Sorville Imnes watched the arrival from the mezzanine gallery above the docking concourse, his four-fingered hands resting on the observation rail, his secondary pupils contracted to their tightest aperture. He had been a xenopsychologist for 31 years. He had studied predator cognition in Thessany warcasts, dissected the hive resonance bonding of Krev colony mines, published the definitive monograph on Sorshi Grief architecture, and co-authored the Compact's field manual on interspecies social risk assessment. He had been invited to Pelinar specifically because the interspecies academic directorate wanted someone with his credentials to observe and document the first long-term human residency at a mixed-species research installation. He had accepted because he suspected the directorate was asking the wrong questions. The human was a linguist. Her name was Catherine Vinn. She was 43 years old, dark-haired, unremarkable in build, and she walked through the docking concourse with the easy, loose gait of someone who had traveled often and expected nothing from the experience except mild inconvenience. She carried her bag over one shoulder. She did not look up at the mezzanine. She did not scan the exits, or inventory the security positions, or adjust her pace to the density of the crowd. She walked the way a person walks through a place they have already decided is safe. Sorville recorded his first observation into the neural thread logger embedded behind his left ear. Subject arrives. Physical presentation. Standard human female, early middle age, no visible augmentation. Carries personal effects in a single soft container. Immediate behavioral note. The subject is making eye contact with every individual she passes and performing the human facial muscle configuration designated as a smile. The smile is directed indiscriminately at maintenance drones, Krev freight handlers, a Pelvesi security officer, a Thanara janitorial worker. No apparent selectivity, no apparent strategic intent. Recommend monitoring for habituation decay. He paused the log. The Thanara janitorial worker, a small gray-furred prey-species individual pushing a sanitation cart, had frozen mid-stride when the human smiled at her. The Thanara's ears had rotated fully forward. Her tail had lifted. Her pupils had dilated to their maximum threat response aperture, which in Thanara physiology indicated not danger but the opposite, the detection of a social signal so unexpected that the brain required maximum visual input to confirm it was real. Then the human had said something, too distant for Sorville's audio feed, and the Thanara had made a sound that his translation matrix classified as involuntary laughter. The human walked on. The Thanara stood still for 4 seconds, then resumed pushing her cart, but her tail stayed lifted, her ears stayed forward. Sorville noted this. He did not yet understand what he had just witnessed. He would spend the next 7 weeks finding out. That was day 1. The briefing from the directorate had been thorough, in the way that a map is thorough when it charts the coastline but ignores the ocean. Sorville had spent 6 weeks before his arrival reviewing the classified literature on human social behavior, and the asymmetry in the data had been the first thing that troubled him. The Compact's xenopsychological database contained 72 published studies on human cognition. 68 of them focused on threat assessment, combat reflexes, pain tolerance, endurance metrics, predator response architecture, toxin resistance, biomechanical force output. The remaining 4 addressed what the literature called prosocial bonding behavior, and all 4 had been flagged with the same notation: insufficient data, observation period too short, results inconclusive. The galaxy had spent 40 years studying how humans killed, and less than 40 months studying how they connected. That asymmetry suggested either an institutional blind spot or a deliberate avoidance. Sorville had read the 4 inconclusive studies twice each, and he had noticed something their authors had not flagged. All 4 researchers had requested reassignment or retirement within 6 months of completing their work. No explanation given. No follow-up conducted. The directorate's brief on Catherine Vin was clinical. Subject: Dr. Catherine Vin, civilian linguist, assigned to Pelinar's Xenolinguistics Laboratory for a 12-month residency. Purpose: translation work on archived Sorshi navigational texts. Security clearance: standard academic. Threat assessment: negligible. The brief's final paragraph, written by a Thessany military attaché, read: Human subjects in non-combat residential settings have historically generated minimal security incidents. Recommend standard monitoring. Sorville had read that paragraph 3 times. The word that troubled him was minimal, not zero. He had asked the directorate what kind of incidents qualified as minimal, and the response had been a single file, a summary of the Bathial Station incident, in which a human civilian engineer had performed an emergency repair in an ammonia ocean, and the station's commanding admiral had subsequently reclassified every underwater fortress in the sector. The summary's final line read: No hostile action was taken by the human subject. No hostile intent was identified. The reclassification was a precautionary response to capability demonstration. A precautionary response to capability demonstration. The human had helped, and the military had revised their entire defensive doctrine. Sorville had decided at that moment that the 4 inconclusive studies on human prosocial behavior were not inconclusive because of insufficient data. They were inconclusive because the researchers had not known what they were looking at, or perhaps had known and could not bring themselves to say it. Sorville intended to know and to say it. The first week was quiet in the way that data gathering always was, long hours of nothing punctuated by moments that demanded explanation. Catherine Vin settled into the Xenolinguistics Laboratory on Pelinar's research deck. She worked standard hours. She ate in the communal refectory. She attended the mandatory orientation briefings and asked questions that the station's administrative staff found either charmingly naive or irritatingly thorough, depending on their species and temperament. She did not request special accommodations. She did not complain about the station's ambient temperature, which was calibrated for Crev comfort and ran 11 degrees below human optimal. She wore an additional thermal layer and said nothing about it. Sorville observed all of this from a professional distance. He had a small office adjacent to the Xenolinguistics lab, ostensibly for his own research, and he spent his days reviewing the station's internal sensor feeds, the communal space camera archives, and his own direct observations. He was building a behavioral map, a comprehensive record of every social interaction the human initiated or participated in, logged by time, location, species of counterpart, duration, and observed outcome. By day 4, the map had begun to show something he had not expected. The pattern was not in what Catherine Vin did. It was in what happened to the people around her after she did it. The Thenara janitorial worker, whom Sorville had identified as Len, a seasonal contract employee from an agricultural colony, had altered her cleaning route. She now passed through the Xenolinguistics corridor 18 minutes earlier than her previous schedule, arriving at the precise window when Catherine typically left her lab for a mid-morning walk to the refectory. This was not coincidence. Sorville had reviewed Len's route logs for the preceding 40 days of her contract. The route had been invariant, the same corridors, the same sequence, the same timing, optimized for efficiency and for avoiding the station's busier social spaces. It changed on day 2 of the human's residency. The Crev freight handler who operated the cargo lift nearest the research deck, a heavy-set chitin-plated male named Drossic, had begun leaving a container of filtered water outside the Xenolinguistics lab each morning. Crev did not drink filtered water. They metabolized their hydration from atmospheric moisture absorption. The container was for Catherine. Sorville checked the corridor camera feeds and found the moment. Catherine had mentioned once in Drossic's hearing that the station's tap water had a kind of metallic taste. She had said it conversationally, without complaint, as an observation while waiting for the cargo lift. Drossik had not responded at the time. The water appeared the next morning. It continued to appear every morning thereafter. Drossik's arrival time at the cargo lift had shifted 14 minutes earlier, just enough to prepare the water and place it before Catherine's typical morning arrival. A Krev freight handler had voluntarily disrupted his own efficiency protocol to provide a comfort resource for a member of a different species. In Sorvel's 31 years of research, he had never documented a Krev voluntarily subordinating task efficiency to a social consideration. Day 6 brought Dr. Pale, a Sorshi linguist who had worked on Pelinar for 3 years without attending a single non-mandatory social event. Dr. Pale accepted Catherine's invitation to share a meal. During the 47-minute conversation, which ranged from Sorshi navigational grammar to atmospheric pressure variations on transit stations, Catherine asked about the specific translation problem Dr. Pale was currently struggling with. Not the project, the problem. The one knot she couldn't untie. Dr. Pale, who had not discussed her work with a non-Sorshi colleague in 3 years, found herself explaining a recurring ambiguity in archaic Sorshi spatial prepositions that had been frustrating her for months. Catherine listened. She asked 2 questions. The second question, which concerned whether the spatial preposition might carry an emotional connotation that the translation matrix was stripping out, made Dr. Pale stop mid-sentence and stare at the human with both sets of eyelids retracted. The next morning, Dr. Pale was observed initiating a conversation with a Pelvesi security officer in the East Corridor, a person she had passed daily for 3 years without acknowledgement. The conversation was brief, a comment about the temperature variation in the East Wing. But it was a conversation, and it was the first that Dr. Pale had ever initiated with a non-academic staff member. Sorvel's cortisol analog monitoring showed Dr. Pale's stress levels dropping 23% in the first 15 minutes of the meal with Catherine. His own published therapeutic gold standard for Sorshi stress reduction, a structured 8-week cognitive reframing program, achieved 11%. Day 9 produced the data point that crossed a line in Sorvel's mind, from anomalous to alarming. Hask was a Pelvesi security officer stationed at the checkpoint between the research deck and the habitation ring. Pelvesi were a social species in the narrow sense. They bonded intensely within their unit hierarchy and showed almost no social flexibility outside it. Hask had been on Pelinar for 14 months. She knew every researcher by security clearance number. She did not know any of them by name. Catherine passed through Hask's checkpoint twice daily. On day 3, she had said good morning. On day 5, she had added, "I noticed you are always here before shift start. That is dedication." On day 7, she had paused and asked Hask whether the new badge reader system was an improvement over the old one, because she had noticed Hask tapping it twice on some scans as though it was not registering properly. No researcher had ever noticed the badge reader fault. No researcher had ever looked at the checkpoint equipment long enough to identify a pattern in the way Hask operated it. Catherine had noticed because Catherine noticed people, and noticing people meant noticing the tools they used and the small frustrations those tools caused. On day 9, Sorvel watched through the checkpoint camera as Catherine approached, badged through and said, "Morning, Hask. Did maintenance ever come about the reader? They replaced the contact plate yesterday. Does it work better?" "Marginally." Catherine laughed, a short sympathetic sound, and said, "Marginally. That is the most honest equipment review I have ever heard." She walked on. Hask stood at her checkpoint, motionless, for 11 seconds. Sorvel zoomed the camera feed and saw the change. Hask's shoulders had dropped 2 degrees from their rigid default. Her mandibular plates had relaxed from locked patrol configuration. The shift was subtle, but Sorvel recognized it immediately. The Pelvesi microexpression for safety recognition, the unconscious postural adjustment that occurred when a Pelvesi's threat assessment system reclassified an individual from unknown to known safe. It was the expression Appel-Vesey showed to members of their own bonded unit. Hask had assigned Catherine Vin to her in-group, not consciously, not through any deliberate process. Catherine's consistent attention, the remembered name, the noticed frustration, the follow-up question, had accumulated past the threshold where Hask's neurological architecture could maintain the classification of stranger. 9 days, 6 brief conversations. Less than 12 minutes of total interaction. Sorville opened a new section in his behavioral map and titled it, Mechanism Unknown. By the end of week 2, the behavioral map had grown large enough that Sorville had to restructure his filing system. He was no longer tracking individual incidents. He was tracking cascading effects. The cascade worked like this. Catherine formed a connection with one individual. That individual's behavior subsequently shifted. They became more present in communal spaces, more communicative, more willing to engage in social interaction with others. The shift was not dramatic. It was not immediate, but it was measurable, and it was consistent, and it was spreading outward from each connection like a pressure wave propagating through a medium. Len the Thanara had started eating in the communal refectory instead of in the maintenance closet where she had taken her meals for 5 months. She sat near Catherine when Catherine was present, but she also sat near other researchers when Catherine was not. She had introduced herself to a CREV environmental technician. She had complimented a Appel-Vesey officer's new duty jacket. Her social interaction frequency had increased by 41%. Her work performance evaluations had improved, not in technical competence, which had always been adequate, but in communication scores, in responsiveness, in willingness to flag issues proactively instead of absorbing them in silence. Drossik, the CREV freight handler, had started greeting people in the corridors. CREV were not a greeting species. Their social architecture was task-oriented. Drossik had not greeted anyone for 8 months. Now he said good morning to the Appel-Vesey security officers at the deck checkpoint. One of them had filed an incident report, categorizing the greeting as atypical interspecies vocalization, intent unclear. Sorville read the incident report and felt something cold move through his secondary nervous system. The Appel-Vesey officer had not known how to categorize a friendly greeting. Her framework for interspecies interaction was built on task-mandated communication and threat assessment. A CREV saying good morning did not fit any category. She had filed a report because the framework had no other option. He pulled the station's social interaction network graphs for the preceding 6 months and overlaid them with the post-arrival data. The pre-arrival graph was standard for a mixed species installation, clustered by species, with thin connective threads representing task-mandated interactions. The post-arrival graph, day 14, showed the clusters deforming. New connections appeared between species groups that had no task-mandated reason to interact. The threads did not lead back to Catherine directly. They led to the people Catherine had connected with, and then outward from them in branching chains. The human was not at the center of the new network. She had created the conditions for the network to exist, and then it had begun to grow on its own. He was watching a contagion. Catherine Vin's behavior, her warmth, her attention, her genuine, undiscriminating interest, was functioning as a social pathogen. Not in the medical sense, in the architectural sense. It was rewriting the behavioral code of everyone it touched, and the rewritten individuals were propagating the change to others who had never interacted with the human directly. And the change was not superficial. Sorville had been monitoring the station's ambient biodata feeds continuously since day 1, tracking cortisol analogs, serotonin analogs, oxytocin-equivalent bonding hormones, and sleep cycle regularity across all monitored personnel. The pre-arrival baselines were standard for a mixed-species installation of Pellinar's size and composition, 11% of personnel above the clinical loneliness threshold, 7% showing chronic stress markers, average sleep efficiency at 72% of species optimal. These numbers were consistent with every mixed species station in the Compact's database. They were considered normal. They were considered acceptable. After 14 days of Catherine Vin, the loneliness metric had dropped to 4%. Chronic stress markers were trending toward zero. Sleep efficiency had improved across 14 of the 16 species represented on the station. The two species that showed no change were the Krev, whose sleep architecture was already near optimal due to their task-focused lifestyle, and the Pelvesi, whose sleep was regulated by unit hierarchy hormones that Catherine's presence had not yet influenced. Yet, Sorville typed that word into his log and then deleted it and then typed it again. Yet, he was a scientist. He dealt in observed data, not predictions. But the data was trending in a direction that made prediction feel less like speculation and more like inevitability, and the direction was everything Catherine Vin's behavioral architecture touched would eventually change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but permanently. He had begun to understand what the word minimal meant in the Directorate's threat assessment. The Bathyal Station reclassification had been a response to a human demonstrating a physical capability, a one-time event, dramatic, visible, containable in a report. What Sorville was observing was not a one-time event. It was a continuous process, as steady and as difficult to reverse as erosion. Catherine was not demonstrating a capability. She was being a capability. Every moment she existed on the station became more like what her neurological architecture assumed a community should be, which was to say, connected, warm, functional, known. And she was not doing it to the station. She was doing it with the station. That was the part that no threat model could accommodate. Sorville saved the graphs and requested an emergency consultation with the Directorate. The request was denied. The Directorate's response read, "Observation mandate remains in effect. No intervention warranted. Subject behavior within expected civilian parameters." The Directorate was monitoring Catherine for combat readiness, covert intelligence activity, capability demonstrations. They were not monitoring the station. The station was changing, and no one was watching it happen except Sorville. On day 12, Sorville attempted an experiment. He positioned himself in the refectory at a time when Catherine was present and introduced himself, not as a researcher, but as a colleague. He told himself this was methodologically necessary. He needed first-hand data on the mechanism. He needed to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of whatever Catherine Vin was doing. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. Catherine asked him about his work, not the observation mandate, which she did not know about, but his academic career, his research interests, the monograph on Sorshi grief architecture that she had apparently read before arriving at Pelinar. She asked him what had drawn him to xenopsychology, and Sorville, who had not discussed his professional motivations with anyone in years, heard himself explaining that he had grown up on a colony station where 14 species shared a habitat ring, and no one ever spoke to anyone outside their own species group, and that he had spent his childhood wondering why, and that the wondering had never stopped. Catherine listened. She leaned forward slightly, her pupils dilated in the pattern Sorville recognized as genuine attentional focus, and she said, "So you have been trying to answer that question for 31 years." It was not a question. It was a statement. It was a reflection of his entire career compressed into a single sentence, and it was accurate, and it was delivered with a warmth that Sorville's emotional processing architecture could not reclassify as anything other than sincere. He returned to his office afterward and spent 15 minutes staring at his hands. His own cortisol analog had dropped 12% during the conversation. 12%. He had documented the mechanism in others. He had described it in clinical language. He had built graphs and charts and propagation models. And in 9 minutes of conversation, Catherine Vin had demonstrated the mechanism on the researcher who was studying it. He logged the interaction under the heading, Researcher contamination, first confirmed instance. He did not stop observing, but he stopped pretending he was only an observer. Week 3 brought the incident that forced him to reclassify his entire study. Tauren was a velicy, a mid-tier amphibian species with limited vocal range, translucent skin over dense musculature, and a reputation in compact species profiles for emotional flatness. Velicy filled maintenance roles because they were efficient, uncomplaining, and appeared to require almost no social stimulus. The compact's psychological profile noted bonding behavior minimal, social attachment unlikely, therapeutic intervention rarely productive. Sorville had always considered that profile inadequate. He had studied Velicy chromatophores, the color-shifting cells in their translucent skin that served as involuntary emotional display, and he knew the cells were capable of far wider expression than the literature acknowledged. The problem was that no one looked. Velicy were background. Tauren had been on Pelinar's Environmental Systems Division for 11 months. He ate alone, worked alone, spent his off hours alone. His ambient biomonitoring showed chronically elevated stress hormones and depressed serotonin analogs, the Velicy equivalent of sustained low-grade despair. No one had flagged this. Velicy did not ask for help. They absorbed distress and continued functioning until they stopped functioning, at which point they were replaced. Catherine met Tauren on day 15. She was walking through the environmental systems corridor and stopped at an open maintenance panel where Tauren was replacing a filtration membrane. "That looks like exacting work," she said. Tauren did not respond for 7 seconds. Then, "It is a standard procedure." "How long does it take?" 40 minutes for a single membrane. There are 12 membranes in this section. "That is 8 hours. Do you do all 12? "Yes." "By yourself?" Tauren paused. His chromatophores flickered from baseline gray to faint blue. Blue indicated surprise, not at the question but at the fact of being asked. Someone had noticed the scope of his work. Someone had quantified it in 4 sentences. "Yes," he said. Catherine leaned against the corridor wall, set down her data pad, and asked him about the filtration system. She asked how the membranes degraded. She asked whether the replacement order mattered. She asked about the chemical composition of the filtration medium and whether the station's atmospheric mix affected degradation rates. When Tauren said he worked from the center outward because the center membranes bore the most load and he liked to address the critical components first, she said, "That makes sense. You start with what matters most." Sorville replayed that line 4 times. "You start with what matters most." It was not a compliment. It was not praise. It was a reflection. Catherine had taken Tauren's professional methodology, his personal system for approaching a repetitive invisible task, and reflected it back to him as evidence of thought, of priority, of a mind making deliberate choices. She had seen the work, and in seeing the work she had seen the worker. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Catherine did not offer to help. She did not suggest improvements. She did not patronize. She listened and she asked, and she reflected back what Tauren told her in language that demonstrated she understood not just the technical content but the professional identity embedded in it. Tauren's chromatophores shifted during the conversation. Gray to blue to a pale, trembling green that deepened as the minutes passed. Green, in Velicy chromatic language, indicated something Sorville's reference materials translated as being known. Being known, not being seen, being known. Visibility was passive, requiring nothing from the observer. Being known was active. It meant someone had invested cognitive resources in building an internal model of who you were, what you valued, and why you did what you did, and had communicated that model back to you. Catherine Vinn had built that model in 11 minutes, with a maintenance technician, in a corridor, about filtration membranes. Torin completed his membrane replacements in 7 hours and 42 minutes, 18 minutes faster than his average. The next morning, for the first time in 11 months, he did not eat alone. He sat in the communal refectory at a table near the environmental systems team. He did not speak to them. He simply sat near them. His chromatophores were blue, faintly, steadily blue, surprise that had not yet resolved into something else. 3 days later, he spoke to them. A sentence about a filtration variance on deck 4. 5 days after that, a CREV technician named Errol asked Torin to review a filtration modification she had been developing independently. She had never consulted Torin before. She had never consulted anyone outside her species group. But she had watched Catherine ask Torin about his work, and she had watched Torin answer, and something in that observation had shifted her own behavioral parameters just enough to make the question possible. Torin reviewed the modification. He identified a flaw in the membrane seeding sequence that Errol had not caught, suggested a revised alignment protocol, and demonstrated the correction with the quiet, methodical precision of someone who had replaced 12,000 membranes over 11 months and understood the material at a level that no manual could convey. Errol watched. She asked questions. Torin answered them, and for the first time in his posting on Pelinar, his voice carried what Sorville's audio analysis classified as pedagogical cadence, the rhythm of someone teaching, of someone who had been recognized as having knowledge worth transmitting, and who was transmitting it with care. The revised modification worked. Combined efficiency improved 9%. Errol submitted a report to the Environmental Systems Division recommending that Torin be consulted on all future filtration protocol changes. The division head, a CREV named Supervisor Deneth, who had not spoken to Torin in 11 months despite working on the same deck, read the report and called Torin into his office. Sorville was not present for the meeting, but he monitored the ambient biodata. Torin's stress hormones dropped 18% during the 30-minute conversation. Deneth's rose slightly, in the pattern Sorville recognized as cognitive recalibration, the hormonal signature of a CREV whose internal model of a subordinate's capabilities was being forcibly revised upward. 2 days later, Deneth assigned Torin to the station's quarterly environmental audit team. It was the first time a Velocity maintenance technician had been included in an audit function at any compact installation in Sorville's professional memory. The assignment was not charity. It was recognition. It was the institutional consequence of one human stopping in a corridor and saying, "That looks like exacting work." And Torin's chromatophores shifted to a color Sorville had never seen in a Velocity in 31 years of xenopsychological practice. A sustained, deep amber that pulsed with each of his slow amphibian heartbeats. A color that his reference materials could not translate because no Velocity in the documented literature had displayed it in the presence of a non-Velocity observer. Sorville contacted a Velocity cultural attaché at the compact embassy. The attaché, a senior diplomatic officer named Tesson, reviewed the chromatophore data via secure channel and was quiet for a very long time. "That color is called Velanthress," she said finally. "We do not have a compact standard translation. The closest approximation is the relief of being a person among people." "Is it common?" "Among Velocity and Velocity communities, moderately. It is the color of homecoming. Among Velocity and mixed species postings." She paused. "Dr. Imnes, I have worked in the Cultural Attaché Corps for 19 years. I have served on 11 mixed species installations. I have counseled hundreds of Velocity in diaspora. I have never recorded Velanthress in a mixed species environment. We did not believe it was possible outside our own herd groups." "What would cause it?" "Someone would have had to see him, not as a Velocity, not as a technician, as a specific individual with a specific interior life, and he would have had to believe they meant it. Velocity can detect performative attention. We evolved in herd environments where social fraud was an existential threat. Velanthres cannot be triggered by pretense. Sorville ended the consultation and sat in his office in the dark for 20 minutes. His secondary hearts were beating in the arrhythmic pattern that his species associated with the approach of a predator, the physiological recognition that something in the environment had fundamentally changed, and the old models of safety were no longer valid. He was not afraid of Catherine Vin. He was afraid of what Catherine Vin was, and what that implied about every assumption the Compact had made about humans for 40 years. The Compact studied human combat, human durability, human endurance, human toxin resistance, human predatory stillness. Every monograph, every classified brief, was built on the premise that humans were dangerous because of what they could survive or what they could destroy. Sorville was looking at data no one had gathered, and it was telling him something different. Humans were dangerous because of what they could build, not ships, not weapons, not fortifications or alliances or political structures. Connections, neural pathways in other species' brains that had not existed before the human arrived and would not degrade after the human left. Permanent architectural changes to the social cognition of every sapient being within proximity, accomplished without strategy, without technology, without anything that resembled a deliberate act. Sorville pulled up the station's medical database and cross-referenced the biomonitoring data for every individual who had interacted with Catherine for more than 3 minutes. The pattern was uniform. Cortisol analogs decreased. Serotonin analogs increased. Oxytocin-equivalent bonding hormones, which in most interspecies encounters showed no response whatsoever because the receptors were species-specific, had spiked in every individual regardless of species. The spikes were not large, but they were real, and they were present in Thenara and Krev and Sorshi and Pelvesi and Velisi alike. 5 species with radically different neurochemistry, all responding to the same stimulus with the same category of hormonal shift. That should not have been possible. Oxytocin-equivalent receptors were species-specific for precisely the reason that social bonding was species-specific. Evolution calibrated the bonding system to respond only to signals from conspecifics, because bonding with a member of another species was, in evolutionary terms, a waste of resources. The receptor did not fire for strangers. The receptor did not fire for other species. The receptor fired for family. And Catherine Vin was triggering it in 5 different species with 5 different receptor architectures, using nothing but eye contact and the quality of her attention. Sorville wrote in his log, either the receptor is less species-specific than the literature claims, or the human signal is so fundamental, so precisely tuned to the deep structure of sapient social cognition, that it bypasses the species filter entirely. The receptor does not know she is not family. The signal is too accurate for the system to reject. He stared at what he had written. Then he added, "This is the finding. This is the thing the other 68 studies missed. The human threat is not kinetic. The human threat is that they feel like home to everything alive." Catherine Vin had been on Pelinar for 21 days. Without strategy, without agenda, without awareness, she had restructured the social architecture of a 200-person research station. She had reactivated bonding pathways in species the Compact classified as socially inert. She had induced measurable neurochemical changes in individuals she had spoken to for less than 15 minutes. With the most basic tools in the human behavioral repertoire, eye contact, remembered names, genuine questions, and the willingness to listen as though the answer mattered. Sorville opened his research log and began writing preliminary findings that would, within 4 months, be classified at the highest level the directorate maintained. Week 4 brought a test he had not designed, but recognized as invaluable. A delegation arrived, 4 members of the directorate's oversight board dispatched for a routine inspection of Pelinar's research output, 2 Thessany military academic liaisons, a Sorshi data integrity auditor, and a CREV administrative coordinator named Voss. They were efficient, impersonal, and accustomed to institutional deference. Catherine was in the refectory when they arrived for their orientation meal. She was sitting with Len the Thanara, Drossik the Krev, Dr. Pale, and Torin the Velisi, a table that 4 weeks prior would have been a sociological impossibility. A prey species, a freight worker, an academic, and an amphibian maintenance technician did not sit together. They had no social framework for sitting together. They were laughing. Sorville watched from the mezzanine and saw Voss stop in the refectory doorway and stare. Her mandibles performed the Krev expression for cognitive dissonance, the recognition of a stimulus that contradicted an established mental model so fundamentally that the processing architecture required a hard reset. Catherine noticed the delegation. She crossed the refectory and introduced herself with the same warmth she offered everyone. She asked their names. She asked about their journey. She asked the Sorshi auditor whether she had been to Pelinar before, and when the auditor said no, Catherine offered to show her the observation deck where the station's exterior lighting created an extraordinary prismatic effect at shift change. The Krev engineers calibrated it for functional purposes, Catherine said, but it is genuinely beautiful. The Sorshi auditor blinked both sets of eyelids simultaneously, the Sorshi equivalent of being caught off guard by sincerity. Over the next 3 days, the delegation conducted their inspection. Sorville watched what happened in the spaces between official activities. Catherine did not seek them out. She did not ingratiate herself. She existed in the communal spaces and behaved as she always behaved. By the delegation's second day, Voss the Krev coordinator had eaten lunch at the mixed species table. She had been walking toward the officers' dining room, and Catherine had looked up and said, "There is a seat here if you would like it." The offer was not strategic. It was the reflexive gesture of a species that interpreted empty seats as invitations and solitary meals as problems to be solved. Voss sat down. She stayed 40 minutes. She spoke, for the first time in her career, to a Thanara janitorial worker and a Velisi maintenance technician. She discovered that Len had a wry sense of humor, and that Torin knew more about atmospheric filters than the environmental division researchers. By the 3rd day, one of the Thessany liaisons had asked Torin a detailed question about the station's environmental systems and listened with genuine professional respect. Torin's chromatophores went amber, Velanthress, because a Thessany military officer had seen Catherine treat Torin as someone worth listening to, and the model had propagated. That was the mechanism. Catherine was not just forming connections. She was teaching others how to form connections, not through instruction, through demonstration in the biological sense, the way a parent organism teaches a juvenile to perform a complex behavior by performing it in the juvenile's presence until the neural pathways activate through mirror neuron engagement. Humans did not simply bond. They induced bonding in others. Their social behavior was not a trait, it was a vector, it was transmissible, and the transmission was not a one-way broadcast, it was a catalytic reaction. Catherine provided the initial energy, and then the reaction sustained itself, because the individuals she had changed were now changing others, who were changing others, who were changing the institutional architecture of the station itself. Sorville documented 3 institutional changes in week 4 alone that had no direct connection to Catherine Vin, but could be traced, through the behavioral propagation chain, to her arrival. The refectory's seating arrangement had been reorganized by the station's facilities coordinator, a Krev named Thren who had been eating lunch at the mixed species table for 6 days. Thren had noticed that the species-segregated table layout forced individuals to choose between eating with their own kind and eating with the growing cross-species group, and she had quietly rearranged the tables into a configuration that eliminated the choice by making all tables accessible to all species. No one had requested this. No one had complained about the old layout. Thren had simply seen a problem that had not existed in her cognitive framework 3 weeks earlier and solved it. The station's internal newsletter, a perfunctory bulletin that had been distributed by automated system for 2 years without a single voluntary submission, received 4 submissions in week 4. A Thenara maintenance worker's guide to common ventilation faults, a Krev freight handling efficiency tip, a Velesi-authored description of the station's atmospheric composition for non-technical staff, and a Sorshi linguist's essay on the etymology of the station's name. 4 species. 4 individuals who had never contributed to a communal document before. 4 acts of sharing knowledge across species boundaries, each one a small, quiet declaration that the knowledge was worth sharing, and the audience was worth sharing it with. Sorville read Torin's Atmospheric Composition Guide 3 times. It was clear, well-organized, and written with the assumption that the reader would care. Torin had written it for people who might want to understand the air they breathed. The fact that he believed such people existed on this station, that anyone might be interested in the expertise of a Velesi maintenance technician, was itself the most significant data point Sorville had collected since the study began. Week 5 produced the data that made Sorville stop sleeping properly. He had begun tracking what he called the second-generation effect, social behavior changes in individuals who had never interacted with Catherine, but had been influenced by someone who had. The results were consistent and accelerating. A Krev cargo supervisor on the night shift, a department Sorville had not even been monitoring, submitted a request for communal seating in the cargo bay break area. The cargo bay had no break area. Krev did not take breaks. The supervisor had begun taking breaks because Drossik had mentioned that the filtered water he prepared each morning tasted better when you sat down to drink it. The supervisor had tried sitting down. He liked it. He decided others might like it too. The request was approved. The cargo bay now had a bench. Sorville stared at the resource allocation record and felt his analytical framework creak. A bench. A human linguist had arrived carrying 1 bag, and 6 weeks later there was a bench in the cargo bay, because a chain of behavioral transmission had propagated through 4 intermediaries, and the end result was that Krev freight workers were sitting down during their shifts for the first time in the station's operational history. He ran the propagation numbers. At the current rate, every individual on the station would be within 2 degrees of social connection to Catherine within 90 days. Within 6 months, the social network would be fully integrated, every individual connected to every other through no more than 3 intermediary links. The compact classified that density as kinship equivalent. It was the network found in close-knit families, in bonded military units, in species that had evolved communal living over millions of years. Catherine was building it from scratch, on a station full of strangers, in weeks. Sorville also noted with the dispassion that was becoming harder to maintain that his own behavior had changed. He ate in the communal refectory now. He had not intended to. He had been eating in his office, maintaining observational distance. But on day 31, Catherine had said, "Dr. Imnes, there is always room at the table if you want it." And he had heard himself say, "Perhaps tomorrow." And on day 32, he had sat at the mixed species table and eaten his meal among a Thenara, a Krev, 2 Sorshi, a Velesi, and a human, and he had not been able to identify the precise moment when observation had become participation. He logged this with a clinical annotation. Researcher contamination. The subject's behavioral architecture does not discriminate between observers and participants. Recommend future studies employ remote monitoring exclusively. He did not stop eating at the table. He told himself it was for observational purposes. He was fairly certain he was lying. On day 35, something happened that Sorville had not anticipated, and that no model in his professional toolkit could have predicted. Catherine was absent from the refectory at the mid-shift meal. She had been called to a communication session with her university on Earth, a scheduling conflict that kept her in the xenolinguistics lab through the meal period. It was the first time in 5 weeks that she had missed the communal meal. The mixed species table filled anyway. Len sat in her usual place. Drossik sat across from her. Dr. Pale arrived and took the seat next to Torin. Hask, who was off duty, crossed the refectory and sat at the table without being invited, because in the cognitive architecture that Catherine's presence had built, an invitation was no longer necessary. 2 Krev environmental technicians, a Pelvesi data analyst, and a Sorshi archivist who had never sat at the table before joined, because they had been eating at adjacent tables for weeks and the boundary between adjacent and together had quietly dissolved. They talked, they laughed, they passed food containers across species lines without comment. Drossik told a story about a cargo mishap involving a crate of Sorshi navigational instruments and a malfunctioning gravity compensator, and Len laughed so hard that her ears folded flat, which was a Thinara expression of pure unself-conscious joy that Sorville had never observed in an interspecies context. Torin's chromatophores held steady at amber. The table was full. Catherine was not there. And it did not matter because the architecture she had built did not require her presence to sustain itself. The connections were self-reinforcing. The pathways were permanent. The community existed now, independent of its catalyst, growing under its own momentum. Sorville watched from the mezzanine and felt his analytical distance finally collapse entirely. He was not studying a phenomenon anymore. He was witnessing a proof. The proof was this. One human in 35 days had built something that every institutional intervention the Compact had ever designed for mixed species social integration had failed to achieve. And the human had built it by accident, by reflex, by being present. He walked down from the mezzanine, crossed the refectory, and sat at the table. Len moved her tray to make room. Drossik nodded. Torin's chromatophores flickered blue, then settled back to amber. No one commented on his arrival. No one made space with ceremony. They simply absorbed him the way a community absorbs a returning member, with the assumption that he belonged. He did not take notes during the meal. He ate and he listened, and for 43 minutes he was not a researcher. He was a person among people. The report took 2 weeks to write. He titled it, Prosocial Contagion, Preliminary Observations on Human Empathic Bonding as a Transmissible Behavioral Architecture. He submitted it on day 42. The directorate responded with silence, then with a classification elevation to restricted institutional. On day 48, a Thessany officer arrived. Not a military academic liaison, an intelligence officer. Commander Tessith carried authorization from the Strategic Assessment Bureau. They met in Sorville's office. Tessith read everything. The behavioral maps, the network graphs, the biomonitoring data, the chromatophore analysis, the cortisol analog metrics, the cultural attaché's translation, the propagation chains, the cargo bay bench requisition. She read for 3 hours without speaking. When she finished, she said, "I want to see the human." They went to the mezzanine. Catherine was eating lunch at what had, by week 5, become simply the table, because every table in the refectory was now a mixed species table. She was talking to Hask, the security officer, about a documentary on deep ocean thermal vents. Hask was listening with the attentive stillness of a bonded unit member receiving briefing, except the briefing was about underwater geology. "She is not performing," Tessith said quietly. "No." Her facial musculature is consistent. Her body language is consistent. She is not modulating for the audience. She is not calibrating warmth. She is not adjusting attention based on the strategic value of the counterpart. Tessith's mandibles tightened. She is the same with the security officer as she was with the maintenance technician as she was with the freight handler. The same investment. Yes. That is not possible. Every documented species modulates social investment based on reciprocal value. Catherine does not. Tessith turned from the rail. Her expression was the Thessany configuration for strategic reassessment under conditions of total information failure. The face a commander wore when the battlefield had revealed a variable that invalidated every plan on the table. They returned to Sorville's office. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that a single human civilian with no training, no strategic intent, and no awareness of what she was doing has restructured the entire social fabric of this station in 48 days. Yes, through kindness." The word sat between them. "Through a specific suite of prosocial behaviors," Sorville said. "Eye contact, nominal recall, genuine interrogative engagement, active listening, emotional state mirroring, and what I have termed reflective validation, the practice of perceiving an individual's internal experience and communicating that perception back to them in a way that confirms their sense of being a distinct valued entity." "Through kindness," Tessith repeated. Sorville did not argue the simplification, "if you prefer." Tessith walked to the viewport. Outside, the station's exterior lighting cast shifting blue and violet patterns across the hull plating, the functional system Catherine had called beautiful. "Dr. Imnes, I want to be precise. I am not dismissing your research. I accept the data." She turned from the viewport. "But I have spent 23 years in the Bureau analyzing human capabilities, and every assessment I have produced has been built on the premise that the human threat is kinetic, physical, measurable. What you are showing me is not kinetic." "No. What you are showing me is that any human can walk into any installation in the compact and begin, involuntarily, to restructure the social architecture of that population at a neurological level. That the people she touches will restructure others. That the effect is self-propagating, self-reinforcing, and irreversible." Sorville was quiet for a moment. "The Velicy cultural attaché told me that Velanthress, once activated, does not deactivate. The neural pathways become permanent. The individual cannot return to the previous state." "Permanently. Permanently." Tessith sat down and pressed her hands flat on the desk. The Thessany configuration for absorbing information that required fundamental revision. "We spent 40 years building threat models around human combat. You are telling me the body is not the instrument. The instrument is the capacity to make others feel known. Every species in the compact has bonding behavior, but in every other species it is bounded. It operates within the species, within the herd, the colony, the caste, the family unit. A Krev bonds with Krev. A Thanara bonds with Thanara. A Velicy bonds with Velicy when they bond at all. And humans. Humans bond with everything, indiscriminately, involuntarily. With the same neurological investment, the same permanence, regardless of the species of the counterpart. Catherine did not decide to care about Torin, the maintenance technician. She could not have decided not to. Her brain encountered another sapient being in distress and activated the bonding architecture automatically, the way a respiratory system activates when oxygen is scarce. It is not a choice. It is a reflex. "A reflex," Tessith said. "A transmissible reflex. The individuals bonded to by a human begin to exhibit bonding behavior toward others, not because they are instructed to, because the neural pathways, once activated, seek additional connections. The architecture, once built, wants to grow. How do you defend against a reflex?" Sorville had been waiting for that question since week 2. "You do not. You cannot quarantine empathy. You cannot build a countermeasure against being cared about. The Compact spent 40 years developing protocols for human combat, endurance, toxin resistance, predatory behavior. None addressed this because no one thought kindness could be a strategic variable." "Is it?" Sorville looked at her steadily. He had spent 6 weeks gathering the data for this answer. He had run the numbers 4 times. He had verified them against the Compact's own institutional baselines, and found the deviation so large that he had briefly suspected a sensor malfunction, before confirming that every sensor on the station was operating within specification, and the deviation was real. 48 days ago, this station was a standard mixed-species research installation, species-segregated social clusters, task-mandated interactions, 11% of personnel reporting baseline loneliness metrics above the clinical threshold, 7% showing chronic stress markers, 3 individuals, including Torin, flagging sustained psychological distress indicators consistent with what a VLSI cultural specialist described as the precursor to functional collapse. Average sleep efficiency at 72% of species optimal across 14 species. Average voluntary social interaction outside species group, 1.3 instances per individual per week. Standard, normal, expected. Every mixed species station in the Compact's database showed the same numbers within margin. This was what normal looked like. And now, cross-species voluntary social interaction has increased 217%. Chronic stress indicators have dropped below the clinical threshold in every monitored individual on the station, including the 3 who were approaching functional collapse. Sleep efficiency has improved to 89% of species optimal across all 14 monitored species. Work output has increased 14%. Research collaboration across species groups has increased 340%. The station's internal newsletter received more voluntary submissions in week 4 than in the preceding 2 years combined. The cargo bay has a bench, Sorville paused, and interpersonal conflict incidents have dropped to 0, not reduced, 0. In 48 days, on a station with 200 personnel from 16 species, there has not been a single recorded interpersonal conflict. Not a disagreement, not a complaint, not a raised voice. That is not possible. The Directorate's own operational projections classified this level of social cohesion as theoretically impossible for a mixed-species installation of Pelinar's composition. Their models predicted a minimum baseline conflict rate of 0.4 incidents per 100 personnel per week. We are at 0. The model does not have a category for 0. Because one human asked people how their day was going. Because one human's neurological architecture is built to detect isolation and unmet social need in any sapient being, and to respond with behaviors so precisely calibrated to the target's psychological requirements that the target's brain cannot distinguish the interaction from being cared about by its own species, because it is not a simulation. She is not performing care. She is caring. Her brain does not distinguish between a VLSI maintenance technician and a human family member. The investment is the same. Tessith was silent. Outside, the light shifted. Somewhere on the station, Catherine was talking to someone, and that conversation was rewriting the architecture of that person's brain. We cannot classify this, Tessith said. We cannot contain it. We cannot build a defense. It is not an action. It is a quality of being. She does not need to intend it. She simply needs to be present. Yes. And every human is like this. Every human I have observed or read about demonstrates some version. Intensity varies. Expression varies, but the underlying mechanism, the indiscriminate cross-species neurologically transmissible capacity for genuine empathic engagement, appears to be a species-level trait, not cultural, not trained. Biological. A biological imperative to care about strangers. Yes. Tessith stood and collected her data pad. She looked at Sorville with an expression his 31 years of training struggled to classify, until it resolved into the simplest reading. She was unnerved not by a threat she could model, but by the realization that the thing she had spent her career defending against was not the thing she should have been studying. I will recommend your report be elevated to the highest classification the Bureau maintains, not because it describes a danger. Because it describes a capability the Compact has no framework to understand, no protocol to address, and no ability to replicate. Will you recommend restricting human access to mixed species installations? Tessith paused at the door. On what grounds? She has done nothing wrong, nothing hostile. By every metric she has improved this station and the well-being of every individual on it. No violation, no law broken. Then what? I will recommend we begin studying what the other 68 papers missed. And I will recommend we do it quickly, because if one human linguist can do this to a 200-person station in 48 days without trying, the compact needs to understand what would happen if they ever tried. She left. The door closed. Sorville sat for a long time. Then he did something he had not planned. He pulled up the station's personnel directory, found Torrin's quarters assignment, and sent a brief message. It read, "Your filtration modification with Technician Earl has been noted in the station efficiency log. The 9% improvement is significant. Well done." He sent it and stared at his hands. He had just performed an unsolicited act of acknowledgement toward an individual he had been studying from clinical distance for weeks. He had done it because it was true, and because Torrin deserved to know it was true, and because the impulse had been stronger than his commitment to observational neutrality. He was contaminated, he knew it. The awareness did not change the fact. And in that gap between knowing and caring, in the space where a different researcher might have felt compromised, Sorville felt something else entirely. He felt relief. The same relief that Torrin's chromatophores had displayed in amber. The same relief that Len's lifted tail had signaled in the docking concourse on day 1. The relief of being a person among people, on a station where being a person had become, quietly and without ceremony, the norm. 3 minutes after he sent the message to Torrin, his data pad chimed. Torrin had replied. The message was 2 words, "Thank you." 2 words. In 11 months on Pelinar, Torrin had never sent a personal message to anyone. His communication log, which Sorville had accessed under the observation mandate, consisted entirely of maintenance reports, system alerts, and requisition confirmations. Not a single personal communication. Not a greeting. Not a complaint. Not a question directed at another person for any reason other than task completion. 11 months of silence, broken by 2 words, because a xenopsychologist had told him his work mattered, and Torrin had believed it, because Catherine Vinn had taught him what it felt like to be believed. Sorville stared at those 2 words and understood with a clarity that hurt, that he was no longer studying the mechanism. He was inside it. He was a node in the network that Catherine had catalyzed, a link in the propagation chain that would continue growing long after his report was filed and classified and archived. He would leave Pelinar eventually. He would return to his university post, to his lectures, to his clinical practice. And he would carry the contamination with him, because the neural pathways Catherine had activated in his brain would not deactivate, and he would find himself asking his students about their work with genuine interest, and listening to their answers with genuine attention, and some of them would notice, and some of them would begin to do the same, and the chain would extend, and the architecture would grow, and none of it would be deliberate, and none of it would be stoppable, and all of it would trace back. Through 1,000 intermediate links, to a 43-year-old linguist who had walked onto a space station, carrying one bag and smiling at everyone who looked at her. He opened his log and recorded his final observation. Day 48, the strategic assessment has begun. Commander Tessith confirmed what my data indicated. The compact's threat models are incomplete. We studied the predator. We should have been studying the bond. Through the thin wall of his office, he could hear Catherine's voice in the xenolinguistics lab. She was talking to someone, and the other person was laughing. Not polished, performative laughter. The rough, surprised laughter of someone caught off guard by the experience of being delighted. Sorville listened, and he understood why the 4 previous studies had been classified as inconclusive. They had not failed because of insufficient time or methodological error. They had failed because the researchers themselves had been affected. They had spent time with their human subjects, and their subjects had done what human subjects did, seen them, known them, cared about them, and the researchers had found at the end that they could not write a clinical assessment of an experience that had become personal. They had been studied, and in being studied they had been found, and in being found they had been changed. And changed individuals do not produce objective reports about the mechanism that changed them, because the mechanism is not an external force. It is an invitation, and once you accept it, you cannot remember what it was like to stand outside. Sorville saved his log. He closed his eyes. He thought about Torin's amber chromatophores, and Len's lifted tail, and Drossik's morning water, and the cargo bay bench, and the way Voss, the delegation coordinator, had sat down at the mixed species table, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, because by then it was. Then he opened a new file and began writing the second section of his report, the section that Tessith would classify and the Bureau would study, and the compact strategic planners would read with the same expression Tessith had worn in his office. The quiet, unsettled recognition that the most dangerous thing about humans was not what they could destroy. It was what they could make you feel. And once you had felt it, you did not want to go back.